All right, good afternoon, everyone. I had intended to offer you a recording of our live session for our Managing Space for Deer program, but unfortunately that recording actually didn't turn out very good. So I decided to scrap it and instead go ahead and just re-record it on my own in private. So hopefully you are seated comfortably and ready to hear about a little bit about deer. Whether you love them or hate them, deer are going to be a major part of your life here in Indiana and in many other states. Some of the best ways to handle our deer populations are by managing the environment the deer are going to be in, either to encourage their presence and the presence of other wildlife if you are a nature lover, or to discourage their presence to protect your property and your gardens and other spaces where deer may simply not be very wanted. So before we dive into how we can use timber stand improvement to protect our spaces or to husband the presence of deer, let's talk a little bit first about deer populations here and in other places. Deer populations, if you've ever lived in Indiana, you know they can get rather large, especially depending on the time of year and the location. Areas like Brown County, Indiana are well known for having extremely large deer populations, and deer hunting is a very common habit here in Indiana. Now, originally, as human colonization and hunting began to overtake deer throughout our time here on this continent, we actually caused their populations to crash in the late 19th century. And this had several laws created in its wake. Many of those laws prohibiting the hunting of what was referred to as antlerless deer. Basically, if it was a doe or a fawn, you could not hunt it. They had to have antlers. This allowed our deer populations to recover. And as any native Hoosier can tell you, this law worked a little too well. We have a lot of deer here in our modern Indiana environment. Oftentimes, they can be rather problematic. During a good year, deer can be very prolific with does giving birth to twins or triplets. And this means that some areas will end up supporting 30 to 125 deer per square mile. So if you can imagine that, 125 deer per square mile, that means that if you like to hunt deer, you don't need to get a tree stand. You can just walk outside with a baseball bat and you're going to hit one. That is too many deer. Environments cannot support that kind of population unless they are an extremely healthy ecosystem. And even then, I very seriously doubt it would work out. So we allow deer hunting and we can manage the space for them. Now, one of the things that's going to help us manage deer, particularly if you are wanting to encourage their presence on your property or in your area, is by managing the biodiversity of the area the deer are going to be in. Biodiversity is this term used by ecologists that basically means the variety of life or number of species within a given area. If you are wanting to create an area that has a lot of deer in it, that means that you want a higher diversity of plant life available to them. Ecologists are going to look at this idea of biodiversity or diversity in general as a sign of a really healthy environment. So I'm an entomologist and I've been an ecologist before, and I've had the opportunity to study things like this. And I can tell you, this is kind of our bread and butter. We have come to understand that yes, higher biodiversity means greater animal populations and an ecosystem that is more resilient to change. This is an ideal setting to have lots of deer coming through. And it means that instead of going after things like your garden as they move through, areas with high biodiversity are going to be providing deer with plenty to browse from long before they ever get to your yard. So in terms of encouraging deer to visit, we are going to have to think about a few things. Deer are serial browsers. They're going to move across a landscape. And as they move, they're going to be browsing and foraging across whatever food supplies they can get, be that vegetation or the seeds of various plants. Deer also have the benefit that they are able to cross habitat boundaries very easily. So many animals are kind of locked within their habitat. They've adapted to it. They're not going to move beyond the boundaries of that habitat. Deer, however, are intended to move across many habitat boundaries in search of food. This is why we have oftentimes bad experiences with deer, because as they cross habitat boundaries, they could be crossing a road, for example. They could be crossing your yard or cross your farm, where they can interact with human activity, human machinery, vehicles, you name it. Deer are going to go where they're going to find food, and that means quite a bit of travel. Now, I mentioned the problems that occur when deer intersect with areas that we want to develop, or they ignore areas where we want them to be present. And this leads us back around to that concept of biodiversity. Because when we experience those intersections, we begin to see that our yards or our gardens get destroyed because the deer interpret that as a food source. Deer exist with very, very low risk of predation, except during hunting season. And there are some areas in the country where there may be wolves, but certainly not Indiana. And there are a lot of properties throughout Indiana that are directly adjacent or have woodlots on them. So that means that you have a deer habitat right there available for them to stop and be safe, browse and sleep, and then move on. So timber stand improvement is the way that I look at to try to either encourage or discourage the presence of deer. Deer are going to be inextricably linked to the trees and hardwoods of Indiana. We are a hardwood state, even though we have so much farming now. This is the environment that deer have adapted in over time. Now, timber stand methods you may have heard of before, primarily used to improve a crop for harvest for trees. And this involves the removal of poor quality trees in favor of improving the environment for higher quality trees. However, a lot of ecologists and foresters have realized that the same principles used in timber stand improvement to improve your crop also tend to improve and enhance the environment for wildlife. And they help remove invasive species that can push out various species of animal and plant. Now, if you're wanting to get started with this, there are a few questions I would ask myself, the primary of which being, do I want deer to be present or do I want to push them away? Now, I'm going to proceed forward from here under the idea that you are wanting to enhance the presence of deer. You may be a nature lover, you may like the aesthetics of it, or you may just simply like to hunt. None of these are bad. This is what I'm going to talk about here is how you're going to work with your woodlot or treed environment to try to provide a space where there's going to be plenty of forage for deer and plenty of cover for them to exist in. So when we consider timber stand improvement, we treat it a little bit like an integrated pest management program. And a lot of you have been to my programs, have heard me refer to IPM methodology before, integrated pest management programs. So in an IPM program, we would first identify the pest. Well, in the case of timber stand improvement, we would be grading our woodlot. We would be identifying the issues and the benefits and the detractions in that woodlot. In an IPM program, we would determine our action threshold, the point at which we said we need to take action to get rid of a pest. Well, in timber stand improvement, we determine our management method after we've graded the woodlot. We know what's wrong, we know where we want to go, this is how we're going to get there. And of course, the final step in IPM programs is to make a cultural change and take any control actions necessary. And in timber stand improvement, that means that we are going to initiate that plan. We have set one up, we've talked with professionals, we know what we want, and this is what we're going to do, so we're getting started on it right now. So let's get started with grading a woodlot. These are some of the important questions that you need to ask yourself. What vegetation types are present? What are the relative percentages of those vegetation types? If you've got an area that's all just one tree type and nothing else, you don't have a very diverse environment. You may see that there's minimal wildlife presence, or what wildlife is there tends to move through very quickly. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you're wanting out of it. But in terms of wildlife, it's probably not going to be an environment that's going to be great for them. However, if you have percentages of multiple species spread out throughout it, we're talking about a different story. Asking yourself what tree species are present and what quality of trees exists is very important. And of course, can they be culled without too much effort? Oaks and maples are very common in Indiana, and oak trees in particular are going to be beneficial to deer species because they provide a lot of forage through saplings, seeds, and they tend to allow for different canopy types. And of course, being able to cull poorer quality trees is going to be important because that way you can make space and open up the canopy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea here is when you ask yourself, can trees be removed? Do you have to bring in heavy machinery? Is it going to be a serious challenge? For example, in Owen County, that's a place with a lot of hills and hollers where getting heavy equipment in and out may be a very serious challenge. You need to be looking at this and consider your topography. And of course, as an ecologist, I would ask, is this part of a larger ecosystem? What is the total sum of the environment around you? Are you connected to other places? Can deer or other animals move through and remain under the trees? Or are you talking about a woodlot that's very small, surrounded by a bunch of farm fields? You're going to be treating these environments differently. Now, as I've been harping the whole time, a lack of diversity is going to limit your number of species, or abundance, that's a word we ecologists like to use, that will use your woods as a habitat, which is why this diversity concept is so important. Habitat connectivity is going to ensure that whatever animals are present can safely move through an area. So even though deer can move across a road to get to a different habitat, they really don't want to. They don't want to intersect human activity because they perceive this as threats and predators. But if you can create a connected set of habitats where it's treed or where there's a nice field with no human activity, they're going to move across it. They're going to interpret that as a potentially safe area. And of course, are the plant species represented going to act as a reliable source of food, i.e., do you have a high level of invasive species? Many invasive species will not be consumed by native animals. So you're going to want to see what's there and is it edible for deer. So what I did in the live program is I asked my participants to please go ahead and grade this woodlot. Would you consider this a good place for deer to find forage and move through? So let's break it down a little bit here. So this is a very great picture. I love this picture. I think it's gorgeous and I'm happy I'm able to use it here. But there are several ecological issues with it. There is no visible understory. There are no plants growing underneath, which means there's no forage available. I cannot see a big variety of tree species. So let's go back a slide and take a look at that. Most of these trees look like they're pretty much the same species. There's a little bit of variation in there, but not a whole lot. So that means that diversity for the tree species is low. It's unclear if there's any opening in the canopy. Now, this is a lovely foggy picture that we're looking at here, but if mist is hanging like this, that means there's very low air movement and there is a temperature inversion, meaning most likely the ground is heating up. There's probably not a whole lot of sunlight coming in. It's just mainly just kind of hanging there. So I don't see any sun in that picture either. And there are no visible trails indicating wildlife passage, which is going to be important. This is a very mature set of woods right here. There could be wildlife passages. Animals could move through even if they aren't finding much food, but I'm not seeing any evidence of that in that picture. Let's contrast it to this image right here, which is kind of self-explanatory. You could see two larger mammals right there. So we know that deer and similar species are going to be taking advantage of this. Let's break it down. It's another great picture, and it does have some of those ecological indicators that I think are very, very good for in terms of finding different species. Obviously, wildlife is present. We could see plenty of understory vegetation with a variety of species present there, so there's plenty of forage. We're not sure how many tree species are there, but the canopy is open. That means that sunlight is getting in and it's allowing understory plants to develop, and it's giving a chance for saplings to develop as well. This environment is probably a mid-successional environment, and I'm going to explain why that's important in a little bit here, but we're looking at a space where there's plenty of young woods with sunlight coming in. It's an ideal situation for encouraging wildlife presence. So a few more important questions to ask. Are your trees mainly old growth with a closed canopy? In some parts of Indiana, that's going to be a yes. And that is going to determine how much animals are going to be willing to stay. Is the understory bare or is it green? This should just kind of go without saying. You want a green understory, they need plants to eat, and that's where they're going to get them. Are oaks lacking in the under and overstory? Oaks are going to be a great food source for deer. Oak saplings are going to provide good tender forage. Oak seeds are going to provide another type of forage that they can consume, though not quite as much as they would like as compared to the green leafy ones. And of course, are invasive plants common? Now, I want to share with you a little bit of my thoughts on invasive plants here because it's actually very, very important. We may look at them and go, well, these are green plants. And you may have heard stories of goats and other livestock consuming invasive plants, and that's very true. However, what I want to share with you is some of the things that have happened to a state park that I work with, McCormick's Creek State Park. So a few years ago, they had a major issue with the spread of bush honeysuckle in its understory. And those of you who have had to deal with bush honeysuckle probably know where this story is going to go. But for those of you who don't, bush honeysuckle can grow very, very thickly, very, very quickly. And what happened in the state park was that bush honeysuckle spread throughout the understory and it began to cut off paths. It was so thick, you cannot walk through them. It was like a wall of just a shrub. If a human being can't walk through it, a deer is not going to get through it. So these invasive plants effectively cut off any passage and were out competing all the other potential food sources. Now, thankfully, through the dedicated work of the naturalists and seasonal workers of McCormick's Creek, they were able to bring their invasive plant issues under control. And the park is just as beautiful as it's always been. But to me, that showed a major issue with husbanding our wildlife, conserving our wildlife in these areas. If invasive species are crowding out everything, they're crowding out all of our wildlife. And we've got to work very hard to identify and eradicate these invasive species as soon as we can. Another important question or issue to work with, both in terms of managing invasive species and creating a good environment for deer, is to work with a local forester. Foresters are hugely beneficial in anything to do with working with our trees. There are several reasons for this. Foresters and wildlife professionals have very specialized skills that are intended for this kind of work. Just their knowledge and expertise, and just having them walk a woodlot alone will give you a wealth of information. Oftentimes, they possess critical information about the local area, kind of like your local extension educators. And while extension educators can come out to your property and they can assist you with this, not all of us are trained in forestry. We will definitely make sure that you have the assistance of a forester. We will help you find one and work with you and them to help figure out what the best steps to take are. But you just need to keep in mind, we may not have the same training as a forester. So I want to go over a little bit now some ecological concepts for you to understand. The reason I want to go over these is if you can understand how an environment's going to change over time and what that's going to mean, you're going to be able to better manage it to improve that wildlife presence in your areas. So the first part of this I'm going to talk about is this idea of early stage succession. Now, succession is the concept of an environment starting from a bare patch of ground. What plants are going to come in first? How is it going to get colonized? And what are you going to end with by the time succession is reaching its peak? So in early stage succession, this is a place where if we had our bare patch of ground, let's take, say, for example, a fire broke out, like a lightning strike occurred and a fire burned everything away. The first things to come back are going to be grasses and legumes that are going to exist in a meadow or an open prairie environment. This is going to contain low shrubs, legumes, grasses, that all are very, very intensely competing for sunlight and space. Because of that image, let's go back to it for a second. In this image, you could see all these plants are just crowded right together. They're pushing on each other and they're trying to reach higher and higher to get that sunlight and to get their roots in and absorb as much in the way of nutrients as they can. In an early successional environment is very, very susceptible to encroachment by invasive species and noxious species. So for example, if you live near pastures, which are kind of intentionally left in an early stage succession environment, because all they're doing there is they're growing grasses and legumes, You may in early spring or early summer see a plant growing that has lovely white flowers and it'll look a little bit like Queen Anne's lace. Well, unfortunately, what it is, it's actually poison hemlock. It's a noxious species. It's actually very, very bad for livestock. It's very poisonous. So we need to monitor early stage successional areas to make sure that they properly move through that successional stage. Next up, you guys saw this image already, a mid-stage succession area. To me, this is the ideal spot to be in if you were wanting deer to come through. What you have here are young forest stands that are less than 20 years of age, and you have mostly wood species developing from saplings and stumps, particularly oak saplings, which are going to be very important in Indiana. That's definitely going to encourage our deer to be present. Mid-stage succession is typically pushed by a major disturbance. Most of our trees do operate on a fire ecology. That means that lightning strikes will clear out major woods and things like that through fire. Once the fire was gone, a lot of those seeds that have been in the seed bank in the ground will now germinate because of that fire disturbance and begin producing the next stage of succession, the new plants that are going to overtake that area. This is going to be the best combination of cover and foliage for the deer to consume. They're going to have protection out amongst the trees, but it's not going to be so thick out there that they can't find food. Which brings us to our last stage of succession, our late stage succession, our very, very mature woodlot that we saw this picture earlier. This is going to be a very mature forest, well-developed hardwoods, at least 20 plus years of development. The only forage available here are going to be seeds, acorns, and that kind of thing on the ground. And old woodlots, well-developed forests typically have very little entry for sunlight because the canopy is very tall and very thick. Now, this allows for movement though, because wildlife can feel safe in here and they can move through and take cover when they need to, but they may not find that much food, so it's not supporting a large population at all. These are not lost causes. This does not mean you're not going to have animals. It really depends on what you're wanting out of this. Because some of you may look at this old woodlot and go, hey, that's a harvest that I can use to help plan a retirement. And you are not wrong. It really depends on what you're wanting and what you're willing to do for it. And there are a variety of options, which we're going to be talking about here shortly. So there are different methods of timber stand improvement to consider. It really does depend on your situation, which one is going to work out best. We're going to look at this in two different ways. Even age forest regeneration, which is a forest regeneration method that operates kind of on a big landscape scale. It's like the macro scale look at things. And it does so by creating very similarly aged habitats through clear cutting or shelter wood creation. Now, when we talk about clear cutting, we're talking about tree regeneration. We're not talking about clear cutting to create farm fields or anything like that. Uneven age forest regeneration is a regeneration method that focuses on improvement by culling poor quality individuals. This can also focus on removal of groups of individuals to help manage the canopy, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more here shortly. So let's talk a little bit about our even age regeneration. This is intended for tree regeneration, clear cutting, I should say, not elimination. So when we do clear cutting, this means that we are effectively imitating that fire ecology by removing older trees to allow for new trees to begin to germinate. We can plant them, we can move them in. This is best for supporting shade intolerant trees and other species, and it allows for selection of particular species. The other method I mentioned there is also shelter wood cutting. This is where you're removing 40 to 60% of overstory trees. You may choose to leave oaks and hickory as a source of shade and future forage for animals that are going through. And this is perhaps going to provide the best combination of sunlight and forage. So what we're looking at here are two methods that look at cutting down large numbers of trees, or comparatively large numbers of trees, to break up that canopy and to allow new trees to begin to grow in. And that is even age forest regeneration. If we contrast this to our uneven age forest regeneration, now instead of the macro scale, we're going down to the individual scale. Single tree selection is a great example of this, where we harvest single trees at certain spaces in the forest in the attempt to remove poor quality individuals to improve the environment for higher quality individuals. The benefit of single tree selection is that this is going to create the least disturbance to the overall canopy and the surrounding environment, because you're not taking out large numbers of trees, you're just removing individuals here and there. This is when you have, say, a forester walk through and mark individual trees that are going to be removed. But primarily, we're looking at removing the lower quality individuals here. This is going to promote shade tolerant species because we're not breaking up the canopy that much. We're only putting certain holes in certain spots. Now, if we want to break up the canopy more, we have this idea of group selection, where we remove trees in 1 to 2 acre blocks. So not quite as many as clear cutting or shelter wood creation. We're just taking out some to poke holes in that canopy and provide glades and other things that animals can move through, and sunlight can come in and allow forage to really develop. Now, this has been shown that it can produce 300 to 500 pounds of forage per acre. So there is evidence that this can be very successful if you are thinking about doing this to try to improve your timber stands. All right, so in summary, for what we were talking about, several options exist that we just discussed to manage woodlots to provide forage for deer. Don't attempt to do any of these unless you have the help of a forester. They are going to be the best people to get started on this. If you do this on your own, you may be missing information. That's why I want you guys to use foresters. No one of these methods is going to be perfect. It's going to really depend on your property. This enhancement isn't going to just go towards deer. It's going to work for many kinds of wildlife. So you will be improving things overall for a lot of different species, from birds to squirrels to everything else, not just deer. All right, and with that, I've got my contact information on the screen, as well as links to our Purdue Ed store, which will have publications that you can use to help look at problems with deer or plants and lots of other issues, as well as our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. When you have plants that are dying or seem ill for no reason, things that you can't figure out, these are the people who can help you figure it out. Please feel free to take advantage of these links or contact me anytime. So thank you for spending your time with me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys at our next program.